You can see me here today, an 84-year-old woman with white hair and hands wrinkled by time, but you can't imagine the story I carry inside me. There are things we keep for so long they become part of us, like these marks that life leaves on our skin. Before I begin, please comment where you're watching this from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. My name is Helen. I was born in 1941 in Riverdale, a small town in rural Virginia that you've probably never heard of, so small it barely appeared on maps back then. Life was different. Young women from good families didn't go out alone, didn't speak loudly, didn't have dreams that were too big. We lived within the limits others set for us. My father was a pharmacist, the only one in the region. My mother took care of the house and gave piano lessons to young ladies from good families. We lived a simple but dignified life. Respect was the word I heard most during my upbringing. Helen, behave with respect. Helen, speak with respect. Helen, dress with respect. I was 18 when I met Anthony in 1959 at the 4th of July celebration at the main church. He was different from the other young men he had studied in the state capital, talked about things I only knew from books and magazines that occasionally reached our town. Most importantly, he was the son of Mr. Jerome Wilson, owner of Wilson Textiles, the richest and most powerful man in our little town. When Anthony began courting me, my friends couldn't disguise their envy, and my parents could barely contain their pride. The pharmacist's daughter marrying the textile factory owner's son was the talk of the entire town. The courtship was quick, only 6 months in those days. These things weren't prolonged. I was dazzled. I imagined a life of comfort and respect, perhaps even trips to the capital. It seemed like a dream from the magazines I read, but you know how it is. Some dreams turn into nightmares when you least expect it. The first time I was introduced to his family, I felt a chill in my stomach. That wasn't just young woman's nervousness. Their house was the most imposing in town, on top of the hill with a view that stretched far and wide. As we climbed the entrance staircase, my legs trembled so much I thought I wouldn't make it to the top. Mrs. Cecilia, Anani's mother, received me with cold politeness. She was a lady, always dressed in black, since she had been widowed from her first husband. Yes, Mr. Jerome was her second marriage. She examined me from head to toe like someone evaluating a defective fabric at the factory. But it was Mr. Jerome's look that caused my first shiver of fear, although back then I didn't know what to call it. He was what they called an imposing man, tall, always well dressed, with a thick mustache that moved when he smiled, but his eyes didn't smile along. He looked at me in a way that made me feel undressed, as if he could see through my Sunday dress that my mother had specially sewn for the occasion. So you're the little lady who bewitched my son, he said, holding my hand longer than necessary. Anthony is lucky, very lucky. During lunch, Mr. Jerome asked questions about my family, my education. When he learned I had a teaching certificate and taught young children, he frowned and said, "After you're married, you'll quit that, won't you? A Wilson family woman doesn't need to work." It wasn't a question, it was a disguised order. Anthony merely nodded in agreement. Without defending me, in the following weeks, with the engagement already announced, I began to spend more time at the Wilsons' house. Mrs. Cecilia decided she should properly prepare me to be a wife worthy of her son. So I went to the mansion almost every day to learn how to manage a large house, receive important visitors, dress and behave like a true lady. It was during these visits that Mr. Jerome began to find ways to be alone with me. At first they were seemingly innocent comments about how pretty I was, how lucky Anthony was. Then came the bolder compliments about my body, about how well my dress suited me. I tried to avoid being alone with him, but in such a large house with so many rooms it was difficult, and Mr. Jerome was clever, always finding a pretext. "Helen, come see the fabrics that arrived from New York to choose for your wedding dress," or "Helen, I want to show you the family jewels that will be yours one day." The touches began subtly, a hand on the shoulder that lingered a bit too long, fingers that brushed my arm while showing me something, a goodbye embrace that lasted longer than normal. I felt uncomfortable, confused. Was I imagining things? Was it just his way? After all, he was an important man, respected by everyone who would believe me if I said something. Things got worse when Anthony needed to travel to New York on factory business. He would be gone for 2 weeks. On the eve of his departure, Mr. Jerome made a point of saying in front of everyone, "Don't worry, my son, I'll take good care of your little fiancé while you're away." On the third day after Anani's departure, Mr. Jerome appeared at my house. It was a hot afternoon in February 1960. My mother was giving piano lessons and my father was at the pharmacy. He entered smiling, bringing a package. I brought a gift for you, Helen, a special fabric that arrived from the capital. I thought we could go to the factory for you to see how it would look for a dress. My heart raced. I didn't want to go, but how could I say no to my future father-in-law, to the most powerful man in town? My mother, upon returning and finding him in the living room, was so honored by the visit that she practically pushed me out the door with him. How kind, Mr. Jerome. Helen, get ready quickly, don't keep your future father-in-law waiting. The drive to the factory was the longest of my life. In the car, he talked about business, about how the Wilson family had influence even in the state capital, about how lucky I was to be entering such an important family. When we arrived, I noticed the factory was practically empty. It was Sunday, only a few security guards were around. He took me to the fine fabric warehouse at the back of the main building. This is where we keep the special imported pieces that we don't show to just anyone. He locked the door behind us. My God, the sound of that key turning in the lock still echoes in my nightmares to this day. It was there that it happened for the first time. When I tried to scream, he covered my mouth with his hand and said words I burned into my memory. Nobody will believe you. I'm Jerome Wilson. If you say anything, I'll end the wedding and your family's reputation. Your father will never sell another medicine in this town. Your mother will lose all her students. You'll have to leave here like dogs being driven away, and you'll be a rejected bride. I talked about young woman. What future would you have? When I returned home, I locked myself in my room and cried until I had no more tears. I felt dirty, humiliated, betrayed. I thought about telling my mother, but his words hammered in my head. He was right. Who would believe me? Against him, who would risk confronting the powerful Jerome Wilson? I tried to avoid going to the Wilsons' house, inventing excuses. But how? A hug that should have been comforting, but felt like chains. The weeks passed, wedding invitations being printed in the capital, the church being decorated, and me getting thinner and paler every day, smiling a smile that didn't reach my eyes. My mother attributed it to a bride's nervousness. All brides get like this before the big day, she would say, adjusting my dress that needed to be taken in with each fitting. And Mr. Jerome continued to find moments to threaten me, to touch me, to remind me that I was in his hands. After you marry my son, we'll find time to meet with more privacy, he would whisper when no one could hear. After all, we'll be family, won't we? The wedding took place in June 1960 at the main church. The entire town attended. I walked to the altar like someone walking to the gallows, hiding my despair behind the bridal veil. During the ceremony, I looked at Mr. Jerome in the front row, smiling like the proud father everyone thought he was, and I felt nauseous. We moved into a house that Mr. Jerome had built for us not far from the main mansion to keep the family united. He said Anthony began working longer hours at the factory, taking on more responsibilities, and I was trapped in that beautiful house that was a prison to me, waiting each day for the moment when the door would open and Mr. Jerome would enter using the key he kept for emergencies. Can you imagine what my days were like? The constant terror, the knot in my stomach, the startling at every noise at the door. I lived in a waking nightmare, not knowing how to escape, having no one to turn to. In those days, these things weren't spoken about, weren't reported. A woman who accused a powerful man would be destroyed along with her entire family. But I knew deep in my soul that this couldn't continue, that somehow at some point I would need to find the courage to break that cycle of abuse and silence. I just didn't know how or when that opportunity would come. In 1961, I discovered I was pregnant. For a brief moment, I thought this would change everything. When I told Anthony, he hugged me with tears in his eyes, so happy he could barely speak. We're going to be a real family, he set his hands on my still flat belly. I smiled, a genuine smile, for the first time in a long time. In my naive, I thought now Mr. Jerome would leave me alone, that he would respect the mother of his future grandchild, that my prayers had finally been answered. But things aren't that simple in real life, are they? He just became more careful, choosing his moments better. But the visits didn't stop. My belly grew along with my despair. I had nightmares almost every night. Sometimes I thought about running away, disappearing in the capital. But how? Without money, without support, without anyone to help me, a pregnant woman alone in the world. And my parents, what would become of them? When Mr. Jerome took revenge, it was in my 7th month of pregnancy that everything changed. It was March 1962. There was a suffocating heat that day, the kind that makes clothes stick to the body that makes everything harder, especially for a woman carrying a huge belly like I was. Anthony had traveled to finalize the purchase of new looms for the factory. The maid had gone out to shop at the market. I was alone at home trying to rest a bit in the bedroom when I heard the front door open. I immediately recognized the heavy steps climbing the staircase. I tried to get up. I wanted to lock the bedroom door, but my heavy body made me too slow. Before I could reach the lock, Mr. Jerome entered. With that same smile that froze my blood. "I came to see how my little grandson is doing," he said, approaching the bed where I was sitting. I tried to back away to protect my belly with my hands as if I could hide the baby from him. "Please, not today," I begged. "I'm tired. The baby is restless." He ignored my words as he always did. He sat on the edge of the bed and placed his hand on my belly. "It's going to be a boy, I'm sure. A strong heir for the Wilsons. You're doing your part." Well, Helen, when his hands began to slide beyond my belly, something broke inside me. It was as if a dam had burst, as if all the anger, fear, and humiliation I had swallowed for so many months suddenly overflowed. "No!" I shouted, pushing his hands away with a strength I didn't know I had. "Enough. If you touch me again, I'll tell everything to Anthony, to Mrs. Cecilia, to the entire town." He laughed. A cold laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Nobody will believe you. It will be your word against mine, the word of a hysterical young woman against that of a man respected by all. You will destroy your family, your marriage, and for what? To be pointed at in the street as crazy, or worse, as your father-in-law's seducer." At that exact moment, as if God had finally heard my prayers, the bedroom door opened again. It was Anthony. He had returned early from his trip, wanting to surprise me. His face upon seeing his father sitting on our bed with his hands on me first registered confusion, then a growing suspicion. "Father, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice strangely controlled. Mr. Jerome stood up calmly, adjusting his suit jacket as if nothing unusual was happening. "I came to see how your wife and my future grandson are doing. You should be grateful for my concern." Anthony looked at me, saw the tears. I could no longer contain the terror in my eyes. Something awakened in him, an intuition perhaps, or simply the truth that had always been before his eyes, but that he refused to see. "Helen, what's happening? Why are you crying?" he asked, approaching the bed, ignoring his father. I looked at Mr. Jerome, who stared at me with a silent warning in his eyes. At that moment, something inside me broke, and at the same time something new was born, the courage of desperation. "Perhaps your father has been visiting me when you're not here. He touches me, Anthony, since before our wedding at the factory, here at home when I'm alone." The words came in a torrent like a dam finally breaking. Anani's face transformed before my eyes. The color drained from his face. Then an intense red took over his skin. I had never seen that expression on him before. He turned slowly to his father. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice almost unrecognizable. Mr. Jerome maintained his pose of offended dignity. "Of course not. Your wife is confused, hormonal, because of the pregnancy. I've always had only paternal affection for her. You know that." "Liar!" I shouted, all the anger and humiliation of months exploding at once. "Tell the truth. Tell him what you did to me at the factory warehouse when he was in New York. Tell him the threats you made to my family. Tell him why I lost so much weight before the wedding, why I cry in secret when I think no one is watching." Anthony looked from me to his father, his face contorted in an agony of doubt. Mr. Jerome tried one last gambit. "My son, are you going to believe the hysterical accusations of this girl, or the word of your father, I who built all this for you, who always put our family above everything?" It was at that moment that something happened that changed everything. The bedroom door opened once more. It was Mrs. Cecilia. She was pale, her hands trembling, holding on to the door frame. I heard everything she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Jerome, how could you again?" "Not again," repeated Anthony, turning to his mother. Mrs. Cecilia entered the room, suddenly looking very old and tired. "Your father did the same thing to my secretary 2 years ago, and before that to the accountant's niece." I closed my eyes. I pretended not to see. I preserved the family name, but I can't anymore. Not with my son's wife, not with the mother of my grandchild. What happened next was like an earthquake that destroyed everything we knew, but that also opened space for something new to be born from the ruins. Sharing this part of my story feels like reliving that devastating moment. My heart still races when I remember it. If my story is touching you in any way, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your subscription helps Bring this message to other women who may be suffering in silence at this very moment. Now let's continue. Anthony lunged at his father with a fury I never imagined in that always controlled man. Mr. Jerome, surprised by the reaction of his always obedient son, didn't have time to defend himself. The two of them rolled across the bedroom floor, while Mrs. Cecilia screamed for them to stop. I was paralyzed on the bed, fearing for the baby, fearing for Anthony, fearing for what would come after this moment of explosive truth. The fight was brutal. Furniture was knocked over, glass shattered. Anthony shouted words I had never heard him pronounce before, accusations, curses against his own father. It was Mrs. Cecilia who finally managed to separate them, placing herself between the two. Enough, she shouted with an authority none of us knew she possessed. Jerome, get out of this house. Now you are no longer welcome here nor anywhere. My son and I will be. Mr. Jerome, with a bleeding lip and torn jacket, looked at all of us with hatred. You'll regret this. Without me, without my money, without my name. What are you? Nothing. Anthony, still breathing heavily, stood up from the floor. Get out of my house, out of my life. If I hear you've been near my wife again, I won't be responsible for my actions. When Mr. Jerome finally left, slamming the door hard, the silence that remained seemed too heavy to bear. Anthony came to the bed, knelt by my side, took my hands in his. Why didn't you tell me before? All this time you suffering alone. His tears fell on our joined hands. I was afraid, I finally replied, freed to speak the truth. Afraid you wouldn't believe me, afraid of what he could do to my family, afraid of losing everything. Forgive me, he whispered, his head bowed. I should have noticed, I should have protected you. Mrs. Cecilia approached too, sat on the other side of the bed. Her face, always so controlled, now showed all the pain and shame she carried. The fault is mine too, she said. I knew the kind of man he was, but I chose silence to preserve appearances. The family name. How many women suffered because of my silence? How many lives did he destroy? While I looked the other way, that March afternoon marked the beginning of something new. Still in the bedroom, with the shards of a broken lamp scattered across the floor, we made a pact, the three of us. No more silence, no more submission, no more fear. The next morning Anthony left early. He went straight to the family lawyer, not to cover up the case as Mr. Jerome certainly expected, but to initiate legal proceedings. He wanted justice, wanted protection for me and for other women his father might victimize. The entire town soon knew. In a small place like Riverdale, secrets of this magnitude couldn't be contained. There were those who didn't believe, who took Mr. Jerome's side, the great benefactor of the town. There were also those who finally found the courage to speak, other women who had gone through the same as I had. Mrs. Cecilia, who had always lived in her husband's shadow, revealed a strength that surprised everyone. She divorced Mr. Jerome, something almost unheard of for a woman of her position in those days. She gave up material comforts, social status, everything to stand by her son and daughter-in-law, everything to do what was right. Finally, the legal process was long and painful. In 1962, cases like mine rarely reached the courts, rarely were spoken about openly. We were involuntary pioneers in a fight that many women still wage today. In April of that same year, my daughter Marianne was born. When I held that perfect little being in my arms for the first time, I felt that all the suffering had been worth it if the final result was this perfect child in my arms. Anthony cried when he saw her. And at that moment I knew that despite everything we had a chance to be a real family. Mr. Jerome's trial took place in October 1963. 5 women, including myself, testified against him. The social pressure was immense. We received threats, attempts at bribery. We were called liars, traitors, ungrateful, but we remained firm. Ironically, it was Mrs. Cecilia who provided the most compelling evidence against her ex-husband. Diaries she had kept for years, recording dates, names, incidents she had witnessed or learned about, but about which she had remained silent for a long time. My silence made me complicit, she said before the judge. I cannot undo the past, but I can help shape a future where men like Jerome Wilson cannot abuse their power with impunity. Mr. Jerome was sentenced to 5 years in prison. At the time it seemed like a huge victory. Today, looking back, I know the sentence was too lenient for the damage he caused to so many lives, but it was 1963, and the simple fact that a man of his social position was convicted was already revolutionary. The conviction was just the beginning of our journey, not the end. The factory without its founder faced difficult times. Anthony took command, but many clients distanced themselves, not wanting to associate their names with the scandal. Employees were laid off, families faced hardships. For a time we were the villains of the story for many people in town, but we survived, and more than that. We began to rebuild our lives on more solid, more truthful foundations, Anthony. And I had to relearn how to trust each other to build a real marriage from the ruins of what we had before. It wasn't easy. There were nights of crying, days of painful silence, moments when we doubted if we would overcome it all. Mrs. Cecilia moved into our house, becoming a present grandmother for Marianne, and later for the other two children who came. She never remarried, dedicating the rest of her life to family and, surprisingly, to social activism. She founded one of the first support groups for women victims of violence in the region, using her own story as an example that silence only perpetuates suffering. That confrontation in the bedroom that hot March afternoon was just the beginning of a long battle. A battle that would continue for years, that would change the course of our lives in ways we could never have predicted. But it was a battle we were finally fighting together in the open, without more secrets or paralyzing fears. I was only 21 years old when all this happened, a girl practically forced to grow up in the most painful way possible, but also a woman discovering her own strength, her own voice after so long in silence. After the trial and conviction of Mr. Jerome, life in Riverdale became unbearable for us. People looked at us in the streets, whispered when we passed. Some supported us silently, others treated us as if we had committed a crime. The factory was failing. Many suppliers cut relations with us, clients canceled orders. The Wilson name, once synonymous with respect and power, had become poison. It was in May 1964, a few months after the military coup, that we made the most difficult decision of our lives. Anthony came home one night more dejected than usual. The factory was about to close its doors definitively. That night, sitting at the kitchen table after the children, Marianne, already 2 years old, and Peter, our second child, only 6 months old, had gone to sleep, we decided it was time to start over elsewhere. We sold everything we could. The Wilson mansion where Mrs. Cecilia still lived, our house, the remaining factory equipment. We gathered what little money we got and left for Boston, the big city where we could be anonymous, where no one knew our story. We started from scratch. Anthony, who knew the textile industry well, got a job as a production manager at a factory in the eastern part of the city. It was nowhere near the status we had before, from owners to employees, from a mansion to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Mrs. Cecilia came with us at 58. She had to adapt to a completely different life than she had always known. The first months in Boston were frightening. The constant noise, the rush, the impersonality of the big city. I, who had never worked during the marriage, first by Mr. Jerome's imposition, then because of the pregnancy and babies, had to find ways to contribute. I began sewing at home, taking advantage of the knowledge about fabrics I had acquired in previous years. In 1966, when Peter was already 2 years old and Richard, our youngest, had just been born, I transformed the living room of our apartment into an improvised studio. I started doing small repairs, then simple dresses for the neighbors, until a client introduced me to the owner of a boutique downtown. It was my first big order, 10 dresses to be sold in her shop. Anthony helped me buy a used industrial sewing machine. We worked together in our spare time, he cutting fabrics, me sewing, Mrs. Cecilia taking care of the children and helping with the finishing touches. It was a hard life of much work and little rest, but there was a deep satisfaction in building something new, something of our own, brick by brick. The whole time we lived in fear that our past would catch up with us. We used only Anani's mother's maiden name, Smith, leaving Wilson behind. When we met new people, we created vague stories about our previous life, where from rural Virginia, we would say, without specifying more. We came looking for opportunities in the city. In 1968, I received a phone call that froze my blood. It was a former neighbor from Riverdale. Helen, I thought you should know Mr. Jerome was released. The sentence was reduced for good behavior. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay looking at my 3 children sleeping, Marianne 6 years old, Peter 4, and Richard 2, and felt a paralyzing fear. What if he found us? What if he tried to take revenge? What if he tried to hurt my children? Anthony tried to calm me. We're in Boston, Helen, a huge city. He'll never find us here. And even if he tried, we're not that frightened family anymore. We're strong. Now we're in this together. But the fear remained like a shadow, always lurking. I began having frequent nightmares. I avoided going out alone. I constantly looked over my shoulder. The ghost of Mr. Jerome, even hundreds of miles away, still had power over me. It was Mrs. Cecilia who saved me this time. One afternoon while the children were at school and Anthony at work, she sat with me in the studio. "Helen," she said, taking my hands in hers, "you can't let him continue to imprison you even from a distance. We've already lost too much because of him. We can't also lose our present, our future. I have something to show you." It was an obituary, a small note in the Riverdale newspaper. Jerome Wilson, 65, former industrialist, died yesterday of a heart attack. The body was buried in the municipal cemetery without the presence of family members. He died alone, said Mrs. Cecilia, without family, without friends, without the empire he built. It's over, Helen. He's really over. I cried when I read that clipping. They weren't tears of joy or sadness, they were tears of relief, of liberation. The monster of my nightmares had disappeared forever. It was as if an enormous weight had been removed from my shoulders. In the following weeks I began to sleep better. I started smiling more. I recovered the pleasure in small things I had forgotten. The taste of a leisurely Sunday breakfast, the sound of children's laughter playing, the feeling of sun on my face during a walk in the park. My little studio grew. I hired 2 seamstresses to help with the growing volume of orders. Anthony, seeing the success of the business, began to dream of leaving his factory job so we could work together. In 1969 we took the step that had seemed impossible a few years before. We opened our own clothing factory. It was a small warehouse in Brooklyn, very different from the imposing Wilson Textiles. We started with 3 industrial machines and many dreams. Anthony took care of the administrative part and sales. I handled design and production. Mrs. Cecilia, even at over 60 years old, helped with supervising the seamstresses and quality control. The 1970s began with a wave of optimism for us. The studio prospered. The children grew up healthy. We had managed to buy a larger apartment closer to downtown. The terrors of the past were slowly losing strength, transforming into scars, permanent marks, yes, but ones that no longer caused acute pain with every movement. America was experiencing the so-called economic miracle. National fashion was gaining strength, encouraged by campaigns like American Style from the government. We took advantage of the moment. We expanded the factory, began producing not just for boutiques but for department stores. We hired more employees, bought better equipment. It was in 1972 that I received the invitation that would change the course of the story. Again, a well-known women's magazine in Boston wanted to do an article on women entrepreneurs. One of the journalists had bought a dress from our factory and been impressed with the quality. They wanted to interview me to tell my journey. I panicked. How could I tell my story without revealing the past we had tried so hard to leave behind? Anthony and I discussed it all night. Part of me wanted to refuse to continue in the safe anonymity we had built. Another part, a part that was growing ever stronger, wanted to speak, wanted to be heard. The final decision came from an unexpected source. Mary, and then 10 years old, overheard our conversation. She knew only fragments of our previous story, things she had picked up from adult conversations over the years. "Mom," she said, entering the kitchen where we were talking in low voices, "why are you always hiding where we came from? Did we do something wrong?" That innocent question felt like a bomb on my heart. What were we teaching our children? That they should be ashamed of a past for which they had no responsibility, that secrets and lies were the best way to deal with pain. The next morning I called the journalist and accepted the interview with one condition: I would tell the whole story, not just the beautiful and inspiring part about the success of the factory. If they were going to tell my journey, let it be the true one. The report came out in September 1972, 5 pages in the magazine with the title From Shadows to Light: The Extraordinary Story of Helen Smith. The journalist was sensitive and respectful. She didn't exploit the sensationalism the story could have yielded, but focused on the overcoming, the reconstruction, the human capacity to rise from the ashes. The impact was greater than we could have imagined. In the days after the publication, we received dozens of letters at the factory. Women from all over America wrote, sharing their own stories of abuse, forced silence, fear. They thanked us for having shown them it was possible to survive, to start over, to find strength where there seemed to be none. Mrs. Cecilia, inspired by those letters, suggested something that would change the final course of our journey: create a safe space for women to share their stories, find mutual support, break the circle of silence that allowed abuse to continue happening generation after generation. We cannot change the past, she said, but we can use our experience to change the future of other women. That's how in January 1973 the Helen Center for Women's Support was born, initially operating in a small room at the back of our factory once a week on Wednesday evenings. Women gathered there. At first there were only 5 or 6, soon there were dozens. They shared stories, anguish, fears, but also hopes, plans, small and big. Victories. Even during the hardest years, when gatherings of any kind were viewed with suspicion, we continued. We disguised the meetings as sewing classes or craft courses. In a way it was true. We were teaching each other how to restitch lives torn by violence, to sew new futures from the scraps of what remained. The following years were ones of growth in every sense. The factory prospered, reaching over 50 employees. By 1975 the support center expanded to its own building in 1974, offering not just emotional support, but also legal assistance, professional courses, daycare for the children of women who needed to work. Marianne, our oldest daughter, grew up observing all of this. At 15 in 1977, she was already helping at the center, accompanying the children, while their mothers participated in the meetings. Anthony, who initially had reservations about our public exposure, became a fierce defender of the cause. When questioned by other men, he didn't hesitate to say, "This isn't a women's issue, it's a humanity issue." Mrs. Cecilia lived to see the center complete 5 years of activities. She passed away in 1978 at 72 peacefully in her sleep. Her last request was that there be no closed mourning or black clothes at her wake. Celebrate the life I had, she said in her final days, especially celebrate the second part of it, the one I truly chose to live. By the late 1970s, looking back at the path we had traveled, it was hard to recognize in that terrified young woman from Riverdale the woman I had become. Years of silence, of quiet reconstruction in Boston had been fundamental, a necessary cocoon where I could heal, strengthen myself, until I was ready to emerge and take flight. The fear never completely disappeared. Scars that time softens but doesn't erase. Certain dates, certain smells, certain sounds can still bring me flashes of the past, but I learned that being strong doesn't mean not being afraid, it means moving forward. Despite it, the years of silence, that period when we lived almost in hiding in Boston, rebuilding our lives brick by brick, were essential. It was in that silence that I found my true voice. It was in that apparent hiding that I discovered the courage to show myself completely. As my mother-in-law, Mrs. Cecilia, said in her final years, sometimes we need to hide to survive, but we can't remain hidden if we truly want to live. And living, not just surviving, was what we were finally learning to do. But life always holds surprises, even when we think we finally found balance, and the circle that began to close that afternoon in Riverdale still had a final arc to complete. It was in 1985, when I was already 44 years old, that I received a letter that made my heart stop for an instant. The envelope had a postmark from Riverdale, a name I hadn't seen written in a long time, but that never stopped echoing in the depths of my memory. The letter was from Mary Sanders, the former wife of the accountant at Wilson Textiles. I opened it with trembling hands, fearing what I might find inside. But they weren't bad news, at least not directly. Mary wrote to tell me she had read my story in the magazine. Someone had kept that 1972 edition all these years, and that, inspired by what I had done, she was trying to help a young woman in town who was going through a similar situation. The difference, Helen, she wrote, is that this time the aggressor is Jerome's son, Charles Wilson. He returned to Riverdale a few years ago, reopened part of the factory on a smaller scale, and has been repeating his father's behaviors. Charles was Anani's half-brother, born from Jerome's first marriage. He was almost 20 years older than Anthony, and we never spent much time together. He was already living in California when I got married. I could barely remember his face. I could have thrown that letter away. I could have responded with a few words of encouragement and continued with my rebuilt life in Boston. After all, what did I owe to that town that had expelled me, to that family that had destroyed me? But in the nights that followed, I couldn't sleep. I saw the face of that unknown young woman, felt the same terror I had felt, saw Charles's face, which in my imagination was identical to Jerome's. It was as if the entire path I had traveled, all the healing I had achieved, only had meaning if it helped interrupt that vicious cycle. I showed the letter to Anthony. He was 48 years old then, his hair already showing gray strands at the temples, lines of expression around his eyes. He remained silent for a long time. After reading it, "We're going, aren't we?" he finally said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. After all we had lived through together, he knew me well enough to know what my decision would be. Yes, I answered, but first we need to talk to our children. Marianne was 23 years old, then in law school, directly influenced by our history. Peter, at 21, worked with us at the factory, already taking on administrative responsibilities. Richard, the youngest, at 19, was studying journalism, all of them new fragments of our previous story, but had never set foot in Riverdale. We gathered, the three of them, one Sunday night after dinner. I told the complete story from beginning to end. For the first time, Marianne cried silently. Peter clenched his fists with contained anger. Richard took quick notes. Always the journalist. I'm going with you, Marianne said immediately. I'm almost a lawyer. I can help. I'm going to, declared Peter. I won't let you face this alone. Richard looked at all of us and smiled slightly. I think I just found the topic for my senior thesis, investigative journalism on cycles of power abuse in small towns. At that moment, looking at my 3 adult children, I felt something I had never experienced before. It wasn't just Anthony and me against the world anymore, hiding, protecting ourselves. It was an entire family, strong, united, ready to face the past with heads held high. Our return to Riverdale in August 1985 didn't go unnoticed. The bus dropped us off in the central square, and it was enough to look around to see how time had transformed that place. The town had grown, new stores, paved streets where there was once only dirt, but some curious glances were still the same as 20 years ago. It's her, I heard a lady whisper to another as we passed Helen from the Wilson scandal. We stayed at Mrs. Germa's small inn, the only one in town. She recognized us immediately, hard not to recognize, with Anthony looking so much like his father when he was young. But she received us with a silent dignity, without questions, just a nod of the head as if to say, it was time for you to return. Mary Sanders met us the next morning. Time had not been kind to her completely white hair, a face marked by deep wrinkles, a curved spine, but her eyes still had that vivacity. I remembered that quiet intelligence. She hugged each of us, lingering a bit longer. With Marianne, you have your mother's eyes, she said, the same brave eyes the young woman Mary wanted to introduce us to was named Lucy. She was only 19 years old, worked at Charles's textile mill as a secretary, just as I had so many years before. Lucy was from a simple family, the daughter of the town's washerwoman. The story was painfully familiar, the compliments that became touches, the touches that became aggressions, the threats to maintain silence. Marianne was the one who conducted the conversation with Lucy in a room at the back of Mary's house. Richard stayed outside, noting important points for his investigation. Peter and Anthony went to the square where the town's men used to gather to feel the temperature, to understand who supported Charles and who could be our ally. I stayed in the living room with Mary, looking at old photographs of the town, reconnecting with a past I had tried to bury. You know, said Mary, half the town thinks you were very brave, the other half still says you destroyed the most important family here, and with it the local economy. I smiled slightly. And you, Mary, what do you think? I think you arrived just in time, she answered. Charles is trying to run for mayor in the next election. He has been using the family name, his father's legacy. Not the criminal legacy, of course, just the business legacy. If he gets this political power in addition to the economic power he already has. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood all too well what happened in the days that followed was like a whirlwind that swept through Riverdale. Richard, with his journalistic instinct, began to find other victims, not just Charles's, but also former victims of Jerome's who had never spoken. Marianne, using her legal knowledge still and information, organized accounts, made formal records. Peter and Anthony had the boldest idea. They went to the textile mill and directly confronted Charles. It was the most tense moment of our journey. Charles, then over 60 years old, was the living image of Jerome, the same bearing, the same look of contempt, the same arrogant tone. You've come back to finish destroying what's left, he said, feigning a tone of irony, his eyes flashing with anger. We've come back to prevent history from repeating itself, Anthony replied with a calmness that I knew cost him an enormous effort. People are talking, Charles, and this time there won't be silence. It was enough to initiate a true revolution in the town. Richard recorded testimonies. Marianne organized what would become a support group modeled after the one we had in Boston. Peter and Anthony spoke with former factory employees who had information about financial irregularities in Charles's businesses. On the morning we were to depart, we found a group of women waiting in front of thee, and there were more than 20 of them of all ages from all social classes in the small town. They were there to thank us, to share their stories, to ask us not to forget them again. Lucy was among them, her face transformed by a new confidence. I'm going to file a formal complaint, she said, and I'm going to run for the town council in the next election. This town will no longer be governed by fear. We left Riverdale different from how we found it, and we departed different from how we arrived. The circle didn't close on that visit. On the contrary, it opened, expanded, transformed into something bigger. Charles never became mayor. In the months that followed, accusations accumulated, not just about abuses against women, but also about tax fraud, evasion, bribery of public officials. A series of reports that won journalism awards. Marianne, after graduating, agreed to legally represent some of the victims, traveling regularly to Riverdale. In 1990, Wilson Textiles, which had passed from Jerome to Charles, closed its doors for good. But unlike what happened in our time, the town didn't mourn. Other small industries were already emerging, other economic paths being traced. The shadow of the Wilsons was finally dissipating. In the years that followed, I watched my children follow their own paths, always carrying a bit of our history in their choices. Marianne became a lawyer, specializing in women's rights. Peter expanded our factory into a brand that had social responsibility as its principal. Richard founded his own magazine focused on investigative journalism. Anthony and I continued side by side, witnessing this transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. How could so much good be born from so much suffering? How could our personal story unfold into something that touched so many other lives? In 1995, at 54 years old, I was invited to give a lecture at Boston University about my experience with the Women's Support Center. I was nervous, I who had barely completed high school, speaking to university students. But when I went up on stage and saw all those young faces eager for knowledge and change, the words flowed naturally. There are moments in our lives, I began, when silence seems to be the only possible path, moments when we hide, when we disappear inside ourselves to survive. And there are other moments, crucial moments, when we realize that our voice, precisely because it has been silent for so long, carries a special strength when it is finally freed. In the 30 years that followed, I saw the world change in ways I never imagined possible. When I was that terrified young woman in Riverdale, I saw women's movements gain strength. I saw laws change. I saw society slowly, painfully begin to face truths that had been buried for generations. The Helen Center, as it came to be called, grew beyond my most optimistic expectations. Today it has branches in 5 states, serves thousands of women per year, and offers not just emotional support, but professional training, legal assistance, temporary shelter. I left the directorship at 70, passing the baton to younger women with new ideas, new methods, but I still go there every week for meetings with groups of older women like me, sharing stories, weaving together the loose threads of our lives. Anthony passed away 3 years ago, a fulminant cancer that took him in just a few months. In his final days, we talked a lot about our journey together, about how that frightened young couple from Riverdale had traveled such an improbable path. You saved me, he said, holding my wrinkled hand. You saved our family when you had the courage to speak the truth. That afternoon we saved each other, I replied, knowing it was true. Today, at 84 years old, I look at my hands, these hands that sewed clothes, that dried tears, mine and those of so many other women that wrote stories, that caressed children and grandchildren, hands that carry marks just as my soul carries scars. Some ask me, Mrs. Helen, after everything you went through, were you able to forgive? It's a complex question. I don't have hatred in my heart. It would be too heavy a burden to carry for so many decades. But I also don't believe that forgiveness means forgetting or diminishing the gravity of what happened. What I did was transform that pain into something greater than itself, like a fabric that tears and instead of being thrown away is reworked into something new, something useful, something beautiful. You can see me here today, an 84-year-old woman with white hair, hands wrinkled by time. You might see just an elderly woman telling stories from a distant past. But what you don't see, what only I know, is that inside this aging body still lives that 18-year-old girl from Riverdale, that terrified young mother, that 30-year-old woman starting over from scratch in Boston, that 40-year-old activist, finding her true voice. They are all parts of me. They all brought me here, and for all of them, and for all the other women whose stories have intertwined with mine, Throughout these years I am grateful for this time I've been given for this journey that despite all the pain I wouldn't trade for any other because in the end that's what we are, stories within stories, cycles that close and open, torn fabrics that find new purposes, new beauties. If you liked my story, please subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and like the video. It makes me very happy. Until next time, dear ones.